Hello audience, Mr. Z here with a live show today. We are doing a reaction to Mr. Beat's latest video on Woodrow Wilson. Now you might be saying, well, why? A friend notified me and said, hey, Mr. Z, Dean, he referenced you in this video, so alright, I'm gonna take a look and see what he had to say about it. Now, some of you might know, I'm a Woodrow Wilson defender. I'm not necessarily pro Woodrow Wilson, I don't necessarily like him. He's not like in my top presidents, I'd say. But he gets a lot of unnecessary hate. Mr. Beat's video, just going off the title right here, let me pull this up. Why does the internet hate Woodrow Wilson? So maybe he's coming around and he's being a little bit of a Wilson defender right now. Wilson is not as, as monstrously, cartoonishly evil as the internet has seemingly made him out to be over the last few years. You can agree or disagree with a lot of his stances, but he doesn't rank anywhere near worst presidents overall. But enough about that, let's get right into this video and see what Mr. Beat has to say.
I am not Woodrow Wilson, and thank goodness for that, because if I was, the internet would hate me. Yeah. I'm Mr. Beat, and why does the internet seem to hate Woodrow Wilson?
Thomas Woodrow Wilson. If you've been around the channel very long at all.
I just gotta stop right here. Could have sworn Mr. Beat had something to do with this. If not him, then, his crowd of, like, Cynical Historian, Alternate History Hub, those guys that he's tangentially, or not even tangentially, but, relatively associated with.
Very long at all. I hate his guts. I hate him enough that, hate's a strong word. I never met the man. He's my least favorite president.
Wilson!
That's
to say I despise the man is quite an understatement.
That said, some have come rushing to his defense.
By the standards of his day, executed the duties of his office effectively and well enough in line with popular consensus, as well as followed through
I like this guy. Gotta check that guy out.
With the agendas of the progressive movement and the agendas of the presidents who preceded him.
And actual historians, not just people who make history videos, like myself, have been much kinder to Wilson. For example, Wilson was still ranked the 13th best president overall, according to the most
That doesn't sound too far off. 13th best? I can see that.
recent C-SPAN Presidential Historians survey. And every biography I've come across about Wilson seems to think his accomplishments outweigh all the negative stuff about him.
Real quick, I'm adding this in after the fact, but what does it tell you that the actual historians and the actual biographies give you a fuller picture of who Wilson is? Meanwhile, the internet personalities are making this caricature of him.
No doubt one of the most polarizing presidents in American history.
Yeah, I don't know about polarizing. I mean, what I've sort of come to the consensus of is that Wilson is almost a litmus test for somebody's knowledge of history. I think if you've garnered the majority of your information about Woodrow Wilson from podcasts, from YouTube videos, from memes, from Reddit, you're gonna hate Wilson, because that's sort of the meme-y, trendy thing to do. If you've read the history books, he's not a bad guy. Okay, maybe that's a little too generous of a statement. He's not a bad president. But you read the history books, you read what his actual policy was, you read about what he's done, and you think about it, it's like, this doesn't seem like it's anything out of place for what was going on at the time.
Further normalized racial segregation. He attacked many civil...
It's a 35-minute video, so I'll probably cover it again later on, but Wilson's own sentiments toward race, I don't think it's necessarily anything that was out of place for the time. You're talking about you're talking about the 1910s here, where a lot of people will blame Wilson for segregating the federal government. What actually happened, here's the thing. Was this a piece of legislation that Wilson, had ordered Congress to put forward? Was this an executive order where he's like, yeah, segregate the federal government? No. What had happened was Wilson appointed a bunch of Southern Democrats to his cabinet, and those Southern Democrats, within their own departments, independently started implementing segregation because that's what they practiced back home. Wilson did not tell them to do this. Wilson did not encourage them to do this. This is just something they did. Now you might say, well, Wilson not stopping them and not doing anything to, keep him from doing that was like tacit approval or something. Okay, but my response to that is, what about all the presidents that came afterwards? The Republican presidents that came afterwards? questions. If this was really so deep an issue, if Wilson was especially racist for allowing this to go on, why didn't Harding do anything about it? Why didn't Coolidge do anything about it? Why didn't Hoover do anything about it? Why didn't FDR do anything about it? Now, you could say he should have intervened. He should have been proactive, and he should have been like, no, you can't implement segregation. But one, the first thing to cover is that would assume that he was a lot more, he was a lot more progressive for his time. For somebody to advocate for that, and very few officials during this time did. For someone to advocate for that, they would have had to be on the far left spectrum of activism for civil rights, which, Wilson wasn't. But he wasn't on the opposite end. He wasn't a segregationist. He was just sort of like a moderate who didn't really care so much about it. And you can't really blame Wilson for this any more than you can blame Taft or even Roosevelt for it. Yeah, Roosevelt sat down in the White House with Booker T. Washington, but he received a lot of lashback for that. And then he tried to bury it and cover it up, and he never did anything like that again. All throughout the previous Republican administrations, notably under Taft, under Roosevelt, and under McKinley, you had the emergence, and this was even earlier but more at the state level, of the Lily White movement. People talk about a Southern strategy that emerged later on in the 60s, but there was a Southern strategy going on way back when, with the Republicans trying to court the Southern whites into their party. And the way they were doing this is they were basically discarding the Southern blacks and just the black vote in general. So what we should say happened under Wilson's administration is not directly his fault. He didn't do anything to stop it, but neither did any of his predecessors. Keep in mind, the segregation that was happening throughout throughout government in general, this was going on all throughout the Lily White movement at the state level. And then Wilson's successors, the Republican successors, they didn't do anything to stop it either. Anyway, I think I took like a 5-6 minute detour, Justin. We're like 2 minutes into the video, but yeah, let's get right back into this.
Many civil liberties, and was arguably the most anti-freedom of speech president we've ever had.
I don't know about that.
He was an elitist, a sexist.
You're gonna call the dude who gave women the right to vote a sexist? It's like, look, say what you will about women and the right to vote, but it's like, you're gonna call the guy who did that a sexist? It's like, are you stupid?
Guy freaking believed in eugenics. And longtime viewers.
A lot of people during that period did. Theodore Roosevelt did, William Howard Taft did. It was, again, you're talking about, you have to take into consideration what was going on at the time. Was it a bad practice? Yes. But back then, it was common thought for a lot of the progressive politicians. Wilson falls into that same camp. Does that excuse it? No, but to say Wilson is uniquely bad for this, it's kind of absurd.
Thing that scientists once thought was impossible. Make a balanced video about Woodrow Wilson. Wish me luck.
I don't know about impossible, man. I did that a little while ago. Maybe not a while ago, like a year, 2 years ago. Time really flies. Nah, but I already did that, man. I wish you'd give me some credit for it. Maybe you will. Maybe you will. We still got a lot of your video to go.
He was kind of a crappy historian. His research was kind of meh. He relied way too much on secondary sources. He was all in on the lost cause mythology, or the narrative that the Confederacy fought the Civil War not to defend slavery, but for more honorable
Hold on.
purposes.
Characterization of Wilson's work as supporting the lost cause, I think, is a little bit of a stretch. He argues that there's more to the Civil War than just the slavery issue, which is true. But yeah, he can be a little sympathetic to the South in his writing, so you could argue that much. It doesn't delve too far into the realm of like, oh yeah, the Confederacy seceded not because of slavery, it seceded for all these other reasons. No. Wilson acknowledges that slavery was a key issue. I could probably, if I can find a little snippet from his book, I'll put it right here up on screens for you guys to read as well.
A historian, man. You just gotta at least try not to be biased.
I don't know, man. Are you trying? Are you trying? I thought this was supposed to be a balanced analysis of Woodrow Wilson.
His writings reflect white supremacist views. In a popular textbook called History of the American People, which was used in school classrooms, I should add, he wrote, quote, "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan to protect the Southern country." Yeah, he freaking praised the KKK in a school textbook.
Hold on. Praise the KKKs is also stretching that quite a bit. What you have right here, roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation. What he's describing here is motivation. Why the KKK popped up. Why it came into existence. There is no praise here. It's an acknowledgement of what the Ku Klux Klan was. When the Reconstruction happened, you had a lot of the Southerners who again felt like they were being occupied and attacked, create the KKK as a terrorist group to combat the Union, to combat the Reconstruction.
Named history as the result of great men, usually white men.
Okay, alright, Mr. Beat. What does he mean by that? What does he mean by that? Let's hear that clip again.
In a school textbook, his writings often framed history as the result of great men, usually white men.
Alright, so if we're talking about the history of the United States, a country that historically has been about 90% white, yeah, it's gonna be mostly white men who are sort of shaping the history of that, you know? It's like what? If the history was like 50% about like African Americans and 50% about white Americans, it's like you'd have overrepresentation.
And he generally just wrote about everything in a judgy way. Still, his peers and colleagues...
It's like the pot calling the kettle black right here. Wrote about everything in a judgy way coming from,
United to nominate a wild card to be the state's governor. Sure, they liked Wilson's politics and loved the fact that he was a great speaker, but they liked more that they could easily influence him due to his perceived political inexperience. Boy, were they wrong. Wilson did win the election and promptly turned on the party bosses, asserting his independence while getting some love as a progressive reformer. I should note that, at the time, New Jersey was widely known as a politically corrupt state. As governor, Wilson signed a bill removing political patronage from state hiring practices. In other words, he brought a meritocracy to the state. He signed another bill that curbed bribery and vote buying in elections. He signed yet another bill that protected workers if they got injured on the job. He got direct primaries in the state for political party nominations, which weakened party bosses and gave ordinary voters more power. That said, all this was much in line with what other major progressive leaders around the country were doing. Also, there was that...
Alright, Do you notice the thing that Mr. Beat does here? Whenever there's an opportunity to attack Woodrow Wilson for something that was a progressive trend or current of the time, it's exclusively Wilson's fault. Whenever it's an opportunity to praise Wilson, oh, well, that was just in the progressive current at the time. Yeah, Wilson did that, but so did a lot of other progressives. Look, you have to be fair with it. It's like, yeah, look, Wilson was a reformer, so were other progressives. Wilson was a eugenicist, so were most of the progressives. It's like, you gotta take the good with the bad there, and you can either credit him for it, or you can recognize that, yeah, he was part of a bigger trend going on. But I think it's very disingenuous the way Mr. Beat is phrasing this and framing it, where he will give Wilson the bad credit, and then the good credit, it's dispersed to everybody. It's just not very sensible, and it's not good history. The good stuff Wilson did, yeah, that was just something all progressives were doing. But hey, Wilson was a eugenicist. Don't look at the other progressives who were also supporting that. No, Wilson specifically. Wilson specifically was the evil eugenicist in a sea of people who opposed. No, that's not how it was. From Roosevelt to Taft, yeah, they backed it too.
Okay, so let's first talk about the racism. Wilson's cabinet was probably the most racist cabinet since before the Civil War.
Which also featured William Jennings Bryan, where is he in this picture? Yeah, where is William Jennings Bryan? He was in there.
Okay, so his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, was just kind of racist, but the rest of us, Wilson's Attorney General,
there he is. And hold on, wait, what?
Cabinet since before the Civil War. Okay, so his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, was just kind of racist.
Just kind of racist? Dude, I wouldn't consider William Jennings Bryan to be racist at all. I don't know, it's Mr. Beat, he's a liberal.
So yeah, despite resegregating the federal government and thus bringing Jim Crow laws to the federal government, Wilson signed a bunch of influential progressive era legislation.
Okay, again, it's what I said before. Wilson didn't do any of that. And again, not even all his cabinet members did. It was a handful of them, mainly the Southerners. And understand, again, it was an importation of that policy from the South. Because keep in mind, you had Republican politicians in charge of the presidency pretty much since the end of the Civil War. Yeah, you had an interruption with Cleveland, but, you know, other than that, it's all been Republicans. So now some Southerners get back into the office, and it's not like Wilson appointed them because he wanted segregationists in office. It's because, well, by that point in time, the majority of Democrats in the United States were from the South. Like, where else are you going to draw them from? William Jennings Bryan was, you know, he was out in the Plains or Midwest at the time. I forget what state he was running under. He had, I think, 1 or 2 New Yorkers in there. And, you know, those guys were a lot more mild-mannered. But the Southerners, you know, it's like the Southerners were the ones sort of bringing this practice from the South to the federal government. Wilson didn't encourage them to do that. Wilson didn't tell them to do that. They just did it. Sure, Wilson didn't undo it, but neither did any of the administrations after until what was it, Harry Truman.
A bunch of influential progressive era legislation like the Revenue Act of 1913, which dramatically reduced tariffs which had previously protected big corporations at the expense of consumers. To make up for this lost revenue, the law put into place the first peacetime federal income tax in American history, thanks to the recently approved 16th Amendment. That same year, Wilson signed the
That happened under Taft, by the way.
Federal Reserve Act, which established the Federal Reserve System, aka the Fed, or the central banking system of the United States that, yep, still exists today. It was one of the most significant and controversial financial reforms in American history.
That was set in motion by Theodore Roosevelt, by the way.
Controversial, the Federal Trade Commission Act, which created the FTC to prevent shady business practices. Wilson signed that bill into law on September 26, 1914, and the Blatant Antitrust Act, which strengthened earlier antitrust laws and banned shady stuff like price discrimination and mergers that hurt competition. Wilson signed that one on October.
This was also sort of an I mean, this goes hand in hand with the whole, this is the bigger progressive trend. Yeah, Wilson did some good stuff insofar as cracking down on big business, but it was building on sort of what was laid down by Theodore Roosevelt in the past. Same thing with the national park stuff. A lot of people think that was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt reserved the lands. Wilson actually properly organized them into the National Park Service. So this is something where it's like, a lot of people like to give the credit to Theodore Roosevelt, and certainly he deserves credit for it. But both him and Wilson also were, that was like a collaborative effort, effectively.
October 15th, 1914. By that time, World War I was raging across Europe, terrifying the world. Wilson, recognizing that most Americans were deeply divided in their loyalties, declared neutrality, basically saying the United States wouldn't take sides in the war. Neutrality was pretty popular with the American public. While the United States stayed out of what was going on across the Atlantic Ocean, it couldn't see what was happening south of its border, the Mexican Revolution. When Wilson was president, the relationship between the United States and Mexico was unsatisfactory. After Mexican authorities arrested American sailors, Wilson ordered the U.S. Navy to occupy Veracruz, which ultimately led to more than 300 Mexicans getting killed and big anti-American riots breaking out. After a revolutionary leader named Pancho Villa attacked New Mexico, killing 17 Americans, Wilson ordered more than 10,000 American troops into Mexico to capture him. They never did. Wilson would ultimately send nearly 100,000 soldiers to guard the American border with Mexico. Despite a growing number of Americans being against imperialism, they seemed to let the Mexico stuff slide.
There's a lot of lack in context here, and I'm guessing we're gonna be talking more about the interventions in Latin America here based on this map. You gotta understand that what was going on in Latin America as a whole, this predates Wilson. This happened under Taft, and this also happened under Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, you talk about the big stick policy, you talk about all the meddling that was happening in Latin America. It was an experimenting of policy. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt goes in there with the big stick policy, very militarily aggressive. Taft comes along and says, we don't have to be so militarily strong-handed with these countries. We're going to use dollar diplomacy. Wilson comes around and he says, we don't want to influence the Latin American countries at all. We want to be good neighbors for them effectively. Well, that was an idealism that didn't pan out, so what winds up happening, because understand that there was a lot of instability here that was threatening, well, Americans directly as well as American interests, because you had American businesses propped up in a lot of these Latin American countries, and they were being attacked. So, of course, Wilson intervenes, restabilizes things, and, you know, people give him a lot of blame for it. This is just like a bigger issue that was transcending not just his presidency, but, you know, that whole early 1900s era.
More controversial was Wilson's invasion and occupation of Haiti in 1916, his invasion of the Dominican Republic that same year, and his bullying of Nicaragua in order to undermine its sovereignty in favor of American interests. Yep, Wilson was the first regime change president.
First regime change president is crazy. How about we talk about, you know, going all the way back to McKinley? We can talk about Cuba, we can talk about the Philippines, we can talk about the Boxer Rebellion in China, we can talk about Nicaragua, we can talk about Honduras, we can talk about Panama. I feel like Mr. Beat doesn't even know what he's talking about here. He just wants to throw and hurl insults at Wilson.
Of course, Wilson did all this in the name
No, it wasn't about spreading American values, it was about keeping the United States safe. You had a deeply unstable situation down in Latin America, and he tried to be good neighbors with them. He tried to sort of let them be and not intervene in their affairs. But what happened is you had the spillover of Mexico's revolution. American towns start getting raided. Then you go deeper into actual Central America as it is. American businesses are being attacked, being taken over. Something's got to be done about that.
Make no mistake, he often used military force without declarations of war. Some did criticize Wilson for being imperialist, but many others were like, hey, at least we're staying out of Europe. Wilson was quite popular by 1916, so popular that he was able to pass more progressive laws, like the Federal Farm Loan Act, which made it easier for farmers to borrow money. And you want to know why else Wilson was popular during his Keating-Owen Act, which banned child labor. And you want to know why else Wilson was popular during his Adamson Act, which established an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. Only having to work 8 hours in one day, it was completely unheard of. Crazy times, man. Wilson ran for re-election, campaigning around the slogan, "He kept us out of war," actually scaring people into thinking that the Republicans would get the country in a war with both Germany and Mexico. Well, he won re-election, becoming the first Democrat to win 2 consecutive presidential elections since Andrew Jackson. He kept us out of war. That's cute. He kept us out of war. Did he? Oh my, how quickly things changed.
He did keep us out of war up until, his second term, things got a little worse. Hold on. Let's just see what he says.
At the beginning of Wilson's second term. First of all, by the end of 1916, the United States had become deeply connected to the Allied side of the war. We're talking mainly Britain, France, and Russia here. The United States had lent billions to the Allies. In January 1917, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning it would sink all ships without warning headed to Allied ports, even American ones. This is a policy that had previously led to the sinking of the Lusitania, a British ship that had 128 Americans on board. In February, what became known as the Zimmermann telegram, a telegram intercepted sent as a secret message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, asking Mexico to join Germany in a war against the United States for interpreting Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico back, outraged Americans. Now, supposedly, Wilson did not want to get involved in this war, but by early 1917, he thought the United States had no choice. Not only that, he saw entering the war as an opportunity to transform it into a moral mission. They weren't just going to defeat Germany, they were going to spread democracy. These beliefs that the United States had a moral responsibility to spread American values like democracy, free trade, and international cooperation around the world came to be known as Wilsonianism. That's a mouthful. On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, famously saying, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Congress...
Okay, so there's a bit to unpack here. So, yes, Wilson did not want to get us involved in the war. Wilson was the peace candidate, but you have to understand what led up to that situation. Germany had sunk, about 20 ships, killed hundreds of Americans. There were German terrorist attacks on US soil in New Jersey and in New York. Of course, there was attempting to get Mexico involved in the war, which realistically they couldn't do, but we already had a situation with Mexico being unstable. We didn't need them spreading that more aggressively across the border and, causing hostility with us. How many warnings can we give Germany before we say, all right, look, we just have to do something about this? And again, this is a matter of looking at Wilson and using him as a scapegoat. The American public, after all the damage that Germany had done to us, after all the provocations, the American public wanted war. The American public wanted retaliation. America's politicians wanted retaliation. And a lot of this, let's also look at this from Germany's perspective. Because, to be fair, Germany had the concern of, why is the US only assisting the Entente? Why are they not being actually neutral? The United States, at the very beginning of the war, was conducting trade with both sides of the conflict. They were trying to be genuinely neutral. What happened is Britain blockaded us. They created a massive blockade and said, well, look, you can trade with us or you can trade with no one. What are we going to do? Are we going to start a war with Britain? Are we just going to stop trading and thus cripple our economy? Are we just going to harm ourselves out of some type of moral obligation to be neutral? Or do we keep trading with Britain because we don't really have any other option? Like, look, we were a powerful navy, of course, but Britain is the superpower of the time. Britain is the world power. They have the world's strongest navy. What are we really gonna do? Here's the thing, too. Yeah, Britain caused some damage to us, but they weren't killing Americans the same way the Germans were. So again, whose side are we gonna take? I don't think it was right for Britain to do that. In fact, I think that should have sabotaged the American-British alliance and relationship moving forward into the future. Like, they acted in bad faith and tried to manipulate us. But, given the situation at the time, who are you going to side with, the British or the Germans? So, yeah, that's one aspect of it. But then there's this aspect of it of being a moral crusade. The world must be made safe for democracy is taken out of context. When Wilson is talking about this, the democracy he's talking about is the United States. He's saying the world must be made safe for us. We tried to be neutral. We tried to just conduct trade with both sides. We were pressured by the British, And then the Germans started killing our people. This can no longer stand. We have to have procedures in place so that this never happens, so that we don't get dragged into a future war. And then people will say that the 14 points were Wilson's Here's the thing. Wilsonianism as an ideology is just... the name is terrible. Because Wilson himself was not a Wilsonian. Wilsonianism is something that was coined and, came to vogue well after his time. It does not align with what Wilson actually believed and with what Wilson actually desired with his 14 points peace plan. The idea was, more than anything, to be able to mediate peace before the conflict broke out. To be able to sit down and be like, look, we don't want any part of this. We'll help you resolve the tension and dispute, but afterwards, if you guys do end up fighting, don't involve us. It's not our problem.
Overwhelmingly approved. Wilson oversaw a huge mobilization of troops. He created agencies like the War Industries Board and Food Administration. Wilson signed a law creating the Selective Service System after the Army failed to recruit enough soldiers. This caused the first American military draft since the Civil War. In Peteru, all American men aged 21 to 30 had to enlist to fight for a period of 12 months, whether they wanted to or not. The Selective Service would draft more than 2.8 million men. Contrary to what you might think, the country's entry into World War I was pretty dang controversial. Many Americans began protesting, and Wilson anticipated this backlash. He promoted propaganda to sway public opinion, promoting the idea that it was patriotic to support the war. Yeah, that's when he saw posters like that. In order to create a chilling effect and basically scare the crap out of anyone, even remotely criticizing the war effort, Wilson signed two of the most hated laws in American history, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. The Espionage Act made it a crime to interfere with military operations, particularly the draft or military recruitment. The Sedition Act, which was even worse, in my opinion, made it a crime to talk trash about the war. Wait a second, doesn't that go against the First Amendment? Breaking both laws could get you up to 20 years in prison. Holy crap. And yeah, the Wilson administration arrested thousands of Americans for breaking these laws, including prominent folks like Eugene Debs, who got a sentence of 10 years in prison for giving a speech that criticized the war and praised folks resisting the war. He later run for president from prison, and I'm not even done yet. Wilson also essentially ran a nationwide spy program for people to rat out fellow citizens resisting the war effort. He authorized his Justice Department to spy on critics of the war, especially those who lean to the left politically, and immigrants. It's always freaking immigrants who get blamed for stuff.
Maybe that this is a whole other discussion to get into, but you have to understand that when the country is at war, wartime measures are important to be taken up for the security of the country. Mr. Beat, I don't think you at all would be critical of the wartime measures that Lincoln took up when the country was at war. Suspending habeas corpus. What was it? That one fella, this politician from Ohio, if memory serves, that Lincoln actually had deported to the Confederacy for criticizing the war. Yeah, I feel like you would not be critical of that. Understand that whenever a war happens, when the United States is in a serious state of war, the government is going to take emergency measures to make sure that our security here, our national security, is not compromised and we're able to win the conflict and keep our people safe. That should be, that should just sort of be a given. As for the immigrant thing of the time, you have to understand that at the time, a lot of immigrants coming to the United States were bringing over anarchist philosophy, they were committing terrorist attacks. Yeah, and especially people on the left. You had the emergence of anarchists and socialists, and they also were engaging in a lot of terror attacks and, riots and stuff. Yeah, you can't really be too critical of that. It was sort of needed for the period.
He even had the post office not deliver mail that was critical of the government. Big time movements. By the time American troops actually got to Europe to fight in the war was winding down. On January 8th, 1918, Wilson announced to Congress his blueprint for a post-war peace that became a big part of his legacy, the 14 points. Yes, there they are. I'm not going to read all of them. We don't have time for that. But it included stuff like reducing weapon supplies, free and fair trade, avoiding future wars through diplomacy, not wars, and self-determination, or the idea that people around the world should have their own say regarding who governs them. His 14 points also included his arguably most important and lasting idea, an international organization in which countries around the world could all resolve disputes peacefully, what we now call the League of Nations. Meanwhile, after years of ignoring protests in front of the White House calling for the rights for women to vote, Wilson finally gave lukewarm support to the idea, and the 19th Amendment would pass by the end of his term. And speaking of gay.
And this is him being just dismissive of stuff. It's like, if this was any other figure, Mr. Beat would just be lapping this up, praising it. But no, because it's Wilson, he doesn't give him the credit.
That's the one banning alcohol. He vetoed its enforcement, but Congress overrode his veto. After the war officially ended at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of the year, Wilson, just straight up left the United States for 6 months to hang out in Paris, where he became a big-time influential member of the peace talks. He became the first American president to travel to Europe while in office. Edith would join him, of course. What resulted was the infamous Treaty of Versailles. Wilson got the League of Nations into the treaty, but unfortunately, the treaty also severely punished Germany, which, would you know it, set up the stage for World War II.
That wasn't Wilson's fault. That was primarily Britain and France, who Wilson specifically told them, do not seek retaliation against Germany. Have a peace where everything is nice and even, and there's no harsh feelings between the countries. France and Britain who were actually involved for the majority of the war and felt that they had more say, said no. You know, we're going to punish Germany. We're going to give them punitive measures, and they're never going to rise up again. Wilson, you might say, well, why didn't he fight back against this? What leverage did he have? Heck, even Congress wasn't backing his peace plan. What leverage did he have to argue in favor otherwise?
Less than 20 years later, when Wilson finally returned to the United States, it was kind of a...
I hate this narrative too. This narrative from the left that Wilson's to blame for the rise of Nazism in Germany, and from the right that Wilson's to blame for the rise of communism in Russia. It's based on nothing. It's insanity. It's just totally made up. I don't know. Let's keep going.
Lynchings of African Americans had dramatically on the rise, and the federal government had done little to stop it. A series of race riots in the summer of 1919 led to the deaths of hundreds of innocent African Americans and the destruction of their private property. By that time, the first Red Scare was in full swing, a period of extreme paranoia and hatred of not just communism, but anyone who had non-mainstream left-leaning political views. This fear led to Wilson's new Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, arresting and deporting all kinds of random people known as the Palmer Rays. He'd end up overseeing...
Not random people. These are people who, you know, let's pull up the details. In 1919, a series of mail bombs targeted prominent figures, businessmen, judges, and government officials. In June, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's own house was bombed by an Italian anarchist. And, you know, before Mr. Beat's like, oh, mr.z, being anti-immigrant, yeah, I'm Italian myself, so get off my back. No one was killed except the bomber himself, but the explosion destroyed the front of Palmer's home in D.C., nearly killed his family. This personal attack radicalized Palmer. He became convinced there was a coordinated anarchist plot to overthrow the government. Alright, so just to be clear, the Wall Street bombing tied to the exact same anarchist network that spurred on the Palmer raids. Horse-drawn wagon was packed with 100 pounds of dynamite and 500 pounds of metal shrapnel, and exploded at lunchtime. The blast killed 35 people and injured more than 400. Shattered windows for blocks and tore through the financial district. Never definitively caught, strongly suspected to be Italian anarchists, likely followers of Luigi Gallieni, who carried out similar mail bombings the previous year. This is the funny thing too, battles elitism while he was in Princeton. And at the very beginning you said that he was an elitist. Called him a sexist, and he's the guy who gave women the right to vote. I don't know, dude. I question whether you know what you're talking about here. Like, look, I know you're a smart guy. I just think that your ideology is blinding you here, and you're just attacking this guy because you don't like him.
Wilson was one of the most authoritarian presidents in American history, and his authoritarian president.
Authoritarian is insane, dude. This was wartime powers. You are making the exact same argument Southerners make about Lincoln being a tyrant. The country is at war. You're falling into the same trap. You just want to attack your opponent. You don't look at them objectively. You're just blinded by your bias here.
This led to future American presidents also abusing their power, often in the name of spreading democracy. So yes, while Woodrow Wilson may have reshaped America's role in the world with bold idealism, he ultimately only seemed to care about white men. And for a president in the 1900s, as opposed to 1700s, this is really, really bad. Why he's still seen as a top-tier president to me is just evidence that he had a big impact. But having a big impact doesn't mean being good. Why does the internet hate Woodrow Wilson? Because sometimes the internet is right.
Alright. Well, that was a stupid video. Look, like, he acknowledged some stuff that Wilson did, but that's a frustrating thing. Anytime there's something praiseworthy about Wilson, well, it was just it was just a trend of the times. Anytime there's something to attack Wilson for, it's all Wilson's fault. It's entirely Wilson's fault. Wilson alone orchestrated all that. I don't know. I feel like this fella just can't get past his personal bias to make anything objective. Like, he can't look at Wilson for who Wilson actually is, and that's frustrating. But anyhow, I think I'm gonna wrap this video up. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.